Welcome back, everybody, to another week of Sunday School here at the Lighthouse Church of the Nazarene in Moravia, Iowa. We're going through the book of Esther this week. We're in Esther chapter 5. So last week in chapter 4, we saw Esther, the queen, tell her cousin Mordecai that she would go before the king to plead the case for the Jews. Why does she have to do this? Well, because a man named Haman had gotten the king to issue a decree that all the Jews across the whole Persian Empire were to be put to death. Now remember, the Persian Empire stretched from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. So the numbers of Jews would have been in the millions. And you know what? Jerusalem also would have been included in this decree. So this decree was to wipe out all the Jews across the entire empire, not just the ones in Shushan in Babylon. So that's what's going on right now. Esther said, I will go before the king. So we're in Esther chapter 5, verse 1. Let's see what we got. Esther chapter 5, verse 1. Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house facing the entrance of the house. So right off the bat here, what does it say? On the third day. The third day of what? Well, it was the third day of the fast that Queen Esther had prepared. Remember, Esther told Mordecai, tell everybody to fast for 3 days before I go in front of the king. Now, she didn't say fast and pray, but we will assume that praying and fasting go together. I don't think the people would have been fasting without crying out to God. There's a point here that we need to remember. It is so important to have other people praying for us, and it's so important for us to be praying for other people. If you go to, it's in 1 Samuel chapter 12. Samuel is addressing all the people, and he says this right here. He says, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you. Samuel the prophet says, if I'm not praying for you, I'm sinning against the Lord. It's so important to have people praying for you and for us to be praying for others. And Esther knew that. She said, have a fast. I want everybody crying out to me. So verse 2. So it was, when the king saw Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of her scepter. So good news. The king, what did he do? He handed out his royal scepter, gave her permission to come in here. What Esther just did right here ranks among one of the great deeds of faith in the Bible. You almost think that Esther should have been included in Hebrews chapter 11 for that whole roll call of the faithful with all that. What can we take away from this? It's not enough just to be praying to God. We also have to put our feet into actions. We also have to be doers of the word. Someone still has to act. We can't just say, well, we can't just pray all the time is what I'm saying. Somebody actually has to do something here. Like I said last week in chapter 4, aren't we glad that we don't have to be timid before our King? King Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. 1 Peter 5:7 says, cast all your cares upon him because he cares for you. Hebrews 4:16 tells us, come boldly to the throne of grace. We can come boldly before the throne of God. We don't have to be timid. So verse 3, the king said to her, so the king says to Esther, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom. Up to half the kingdom. Where have we seen this phrase before? Well, actually, we see it in the book of Mark when Herod has John the Baptist beheaded. It says that the daughter of Herodias was dancing before Herod and pleased him. And Herod says, what do you want? I'll give it to you. Up to half my kingdom. And she says, I want the head of John the Baptist here on a platter. So, we've seen this up to half the kingdom here. I'm going to guess it's just a proverbial expression and not a literal one. I doubt Herod was going to give some dancing girl half his kingdom. I doubt the king here was going to give Esther half his kingdom. But there probably is some wisdom here for guys. If you don't treat your wife good, guess what? They will end up with half your stuff, won't they? So the king said, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half your kingdom. Verse 4, so Esther answered, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have provided for him. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly, so that he may do as Esther had said. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done." The king's telling Esther, "You're the queen. Whatever you want, I will do it for you." Verse 7. Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and to fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet, which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king had said." It almost seems like Esther got cold feet here, doesn't it? She says, "I have a banquet that I want the king and Haman to come to." So they have this banquet, they come to it, and the king says, "All right, what do you want, Esther?" And she says, "I'm going to have another banquet tomorrow, and I want you to come to that one, and then I'll tell you what it is." This actually isn't Esther getting cold feet. What we have here is actually the providence of God, God moving in all these situations. Because it's interesting. This very night, the king is going to realize, we'll study this next week in chapter 6, the king's going to realize that he never rewarded Mordecai for saving his life 5 years earlier, and that he needed to rectify that situation right away. So, is it just happenstance that 5 years ago Mordecai saved his life, and just this very night the king's going to remember it? No, it's God working through all these situations. The same way he works through in your life and in my life, just in everyday situations. And someday when we get to the end, we'll know that, yep, there was God all along, working everything out for our own good, was he not? So the interesting thing, like between chapters 4 and the rest of the book, everything's going to happen in about 48 hours. Everything's happening real quick right now. So verse 9. So they had one banquet. The king and Haman were there. Esther says, "I'm going to have another banquet the next night, and that's when I'll tell you what's going on." So verse 9. So Haman went out that day, joyful and with a glad heart. But why is he joyful and glad? Well, he's been drinking wine, and it was just him and the king in the queen's banquet. Haman really thinks he's somebody right now. He has some false confidence. So Haman went out that day, joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gates, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. If you see someone and get all worked up in it, it means you have a bitterness problem. It means you have a forgiveness problem. The book of Hebrews says, "Do not let a root of bitterness spring up in you." I've heard it said, bitterness is a poison that you drink yourself because of someone else. Let's think about this for a second. Haman is the second in the kingdom. He has riches and greatness, and the disapproval of just one person makes him feel worthless, and he can't even enjoy anything else. We have to make sure that we don't carry this hatred and bitterness towards anybody else. We as Christians, we're told to love one another. Jesus sat in the upper room and said, "And a new commandment I give you, that you love one another. As I have loved you, you all love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, because you have love for one another." Some other verses. 1 John 4:20 says, "If anyone says, 'I love God,' and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother, whom he can see, how can he love God, whom he cannot see?" Jesus said, "Forgive others, and your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your heavenly Father forgive you." We need to remember all these things right here. So Haman, he goes out. He was in a great mood. Just the sight of Mordecai, he's like, "Ooh, life stinks now." So where are we at here? We're in verse 10. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. What's Haman's problem here? It's pride, isn't it? The Bible tells us in Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. This just almost makes you sick reading it, doesn't it? Haman calls all his family and all his friends, his wife, and what does he do? Just tells them how great he is. And, it just makes you feel gross reading it. The man really has a problem here. This reminds me in Daniel chapter 4, King Nebuchadnezzar. God had to humble King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar went out and said, Look at this great kingdom that I have built by my power, by my wisdom, and by my might. And what did God do? Struck him down and he ate grass for 7 years right here. You know, everybody is susceptible to pride. You, me, it's a dangerous sin that we all have to be careful of. James 4:20 says, humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. We need to remember, if the Lord has blessed us in any way, with a great family, with powerful positions, worldly possessions, we would be wise to remember the words of John the Baptist, who said in John 3:27, a man can receive nothing unless it has been given to him from above. James 1:17 says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Anything good in our life, it was all the blessings of God, and we need to remember that. Verse 12. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. Haman has a false confidence right now. As I said, he thought he had it made. He's like, look how important I am. The queen loves me, but guess what? He's less than 12 hours away from death right now, him and all his family. This reminds me of the parable of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12, where he says, I have everything I need. What should I do? I know I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger barns to say to myself, self, you have it made. Eat, drink, and be merry. God said, you fool, for this very night your life will be taken from you. And then whose things will those be that you have laid up like this? So he has a false confidence. He's about to die, and he thinks he has it made right now. Verse 13, yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gates. So Haman just told all his friends and family how great and powerful and important he is, and that, he's second in command, and only him and the king is Esther called. But then he says what here? All of it means nothing as long as I see Mordecai sitting at the gates right there. This is insane right here. But there's so many people that do this exact same thing. What does Haman have? An invitation from the king. He has a big family. He has riches, rewards, and he can't even enjoy any of it. All because he's focused on something like that. A mere fraction of what Haman had should be enough to make anybody happy and be a blessing. A person of joy can be happy with nothing, can they not? But there were people that would love to have a fraction of what you or I have also. And what do? We always focus on the one thing we don't have. This is a very important point right here. If you haven't been listening, pay attention now. Everything is nothing without that one thing. And what is that one thing? That one thing is Jesus Christ. David said in the Psalm, one thing I desire, one thing I will seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord. David said, one thing I desire, one thing I seek. Worldly happiness is dependent on circumstances. But Jesus said, anyone who drinks the water that I give will never thirst. Nothing will make you happy until you can be happy with nothing except for Jesus Christ. So Haman has all the world's goods. He has everything. But what does he say? It means nothing as long as Mordecai's sitting there at the gate. So verse 14, we're almost done. Then his wife, Zeresh, and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high. Remember, a cubit is the distance from your elbow to your fingertips. So this, a foot and a half, this would be a 75-foot tall gallows right here. And if you remember, what is a gallows? It's just a long pole that they impale you on. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And all the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. Let's think about this right here. All this hatred and bitterness that Haman has for Mordecai, it's even infected his family, has it not? Hatred can cause us to do horrible things. Somehow, Haman could have Mordecai impaled on a pole, and he could find pleasure in watching that. But, we also have to think about this. Think about the culture at the time. They were probably used to seeing people killed all the time like that, and so they were probably callous to it. But in our own culture, what have we gotten callous to over time that just 50 years ago would have been completely unacceptable? Now we all have something in our mind that we're thinking about right now that the culture would not have accepted 50 years ago, but now we're like, okay, yep, I mean, that's just part of it, right? So we're done with chapter 5. Next week we'll be in chapter 6. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I'll see you the same time, same place next week. Bye.